in the tranquil, rolling fields of Westmoreland County, Virginia, beneath a sky stretched wide and clear over the Potomac River. A child entered the world on a crisp February day in 1732. His name was George Washington. At the moment of his birth, there were no omens of greatness, no prophetic stars blazing in the heavens. He was simply the first son of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington, a couple of the Virginia gentry, respected, but not among the wealthiest. Yet from these humble origins would rise a man destined to shape the very soul of a nation. George's childhood was marked by discipline and resilience. When he was only 11, his father died, leaving his mother Mary a widow with limited means but a steadfast spirit. His formal education was brief, just enough to master basic mathematics, surveying, and practical skills. But where books were scarce, the world around him became his tutor. The woods and rivers, the stubborn soil of Virginia's farms, the quiet dignity of hard work. Tall, strong, and with a natural air of command even as a boy, George learned patience, duty, and the value of integrity. By the age of 17, Washington was already a skilled surveyor, charting the vast wilderness of Virginia. The rugged frontier became his classroom, a place where he learned to lead men, negotiate with native tribes, and map the land with the eye of a strategist. But it was the drumbeats of war that would call him to his true path. At 20, Washington joined the Virginia militia, and soon found himself thrust into the fierce conflict known as the French and Indian War. It was here, amid the thick forests and brutal skirmishes, that his character was forged. He suffered his first defeat at Fort Necessity in 1754, a stinging lesson in humility. But he also proved his courage under fire, earning respect even in the face of failure. At the disastrous Battle of the Monongahela, while other officers fell, Washington rode fearlessly, rallying shattered troops, with bullets ripping through his coat but leaving him unharmed, a survivor in the chaos. Returning to Virginia, Washington seemed to settle into the life of a planter at his estate, Mount Vernon, where he married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow who brought both fortune and family into his life. Yet beneath the serene surface of plantation life, his restless spirit watched the growing tensions between Britain and its American colonies. As Parliament imposed taxes and tightened its grip on the colonies, Washington's quiet discontent turned to resolve. By 1775, with the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord, he was called to lead the Continental Army, an untrained, underfunded, and often desperate force facing the might of the British Empire. For 8 harrowing years, Washington fought a war that was as much about survival as it was about victory. He led his men through brutal winters at Valley Forge, where hunger and disease threatened to destroy the army. But Washington's steadfast presence, his ability to endure suffering alongside his soldiers, turned despair into determination. His victories at Trenton, Princeton, and finally at Yorktown in 1781 were not just triumphs of strategy, but of unyielding spirit. When the war ended, the world watched to see what Washington would do. With his army at his back, he could have seized power, could have crowned himself king of a new land. Instead, he resigned his commission, returning quietly to Mount Vernon, a gesture so rare that it echoed around the world. Yet peace was fragile. The new nation struggled under the weak Articles of Confederation. In 1787, Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention, his mere presence lending credibility to the debates. And when the Constitution was ratified, there was but one man the people trusted to be their first president. Washington's presidency was a journey through uncharted waters. He established the cabinet, guided the nation through internal unrest like the Whiskey Rebellion, and steered a course of neutrality in a world roiled by European wars. He could have ruled for life, but he chose to step down after 2 terms, ensuring that power in America would pass peacefully from one leader to another. In his farewell address, he warned against the dangers of political factions and foreign entanglements, his words a beacon for generations to come. Retiring to Mount Vernon, Washington hoped for peace, but his sense of duty never left him. When the threat of war with France loomed, he once again agreed to lead the army, though age and illness would soon claim him. On a cold December day in 1799, George Washington breathed his last. Across the nation, bells tolled and candles flickered in mourning. Even in Europe, kings who had once watched the American Revolution with disdain now paid tribute to the man who had defied an empire. George Washington was more than a soldier, more than a president. He was the quiet, steady heart of a young nation, a leader who walked away from power when he could have claimed it forever, and who left behind not just a country, but an ideal. That true greatness is found not in ambition, but in service. In the quiet village of Braintree, Massachusetts, on an autumn day in the year 1735, the crisp air carried the scent of turning leaves and wood smoke. In a modest farmhouse, Mary and John Adams welcomed their first son, a boy whose sharp gaze and restless spirit would one day carve his name into the history of a nation. His name was John Adams, and though the world he was born into seemed small, his destiny was anything but. John's childhood was one of simplicity and hard work. His father, a farmer and shoemaker, believed in honest labor and plain virtues, while his mother instilled in him a fierce sense of duty and faith. At first, young John found school a dull prison, preferring the wild freedom of the fields, the cool shade of the forest, and the endless questions that danced in his curious mind. But as he grew, so did his hunger for knowledge. At 14, he entered Harvard College, a world of dusty books, spirited debates, and a new understanding of law and philosophy. His sharp mind and eloquent speech soon set him apart. Yet it was not ambition for power that drove him, but a passion for truth and justice. Adams became a lawyer in Boston, where his reputation grew as a man who would stand for what was right, no matter the cost. And it was in this spirit that, in 1770, he made a choice that would forever mark him. When British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, in what would become known as the Boston Massacre. Adams agreed to defend them in court. "Facts are stubborn things," he declared, arguing that even the hated must be given a fair trial. It was a decision that brought him scorn from some, but it was a testament to his unwavering belief in the rule of law. As the storm of revolution began to rise, Adams's voice became a beacon of fiery conviction. At the Continental Congress, he stood among giants: Washington, Jefferson, Franklin. Yet it was Adams who drove the call for independence. His words cut through doubt, urging his fellow delegates to cast off the chains of British tyranny. When Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, it was Adams who fought to see it adopted, his voice a constant spark of defiance and hope. But even as the revolution unfolded, Adams's battles were not only against British rule. Sent across the Atlantic as a diplomat, he faced storms at sea, hostile courts, and the cold corridors of European politics. In Paris, he negotiated with the French. In the Dutch Republic, he secured vital loans, and in 1783, he helped draft the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war and won American independence. Yet for all his fierce patriotism, Adams was also a man of the heart. His letters to his wife Abigail, written across years of separation, reveal a love as strong as his devotion to his country. "My dearest friend," he would begin. And in her replies, Abigail's wisdom and warmth became his constant guide. When the war ended, Adams became America's first vice president, serving under George Washington. The role, he once complained, was the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Yet he fulfilled his duty, presiding over the Senate, watching as the young republic struggled to find its footing. And in 1796, when Washington stepped down, Adams was elected the second president of the United States. His presidency was a turbulent chapter. France, once an ally, became a threat, and the country was divided between Federalists and Republicans. Adams struggled to keep America out of war, choosing diplomacy over conflict, a decision that cost him political support but preserved the young nation. Even more controversial were the Alien and Sedition Acts, laws passed under his administration that many saw as a betrayal of the very freedoms he had fought to secure. In 1800, Adams lost the presidency to his old friend turned rival, Thomas Jefferson. It was a bitter defeat, but Adams left Washington peacefully, setting a precedent for the peaceful transfer of power, one of his greatest legacies. In his final years, Adams returned to his farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, where he found solace in family, books, and the letters he exchanged with Jefferson. The two men, once fierce opponents, became wise old friends, their correspondence a treasure of philosophical reflections and shared memories. On July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams lay dying. His final words, whispered with his last breath, were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Unbeknownst to him, Jefferson had passed away just hours earlier. John Adams was never the most glamorous of the founding fathers, nor the most beloved. He was stubborn, proud, and often misunderstood. But he was also brilliant, principled, and indispensable. He stood not for personal glory, but for the rule of law, the principles of liberty, and the enduring hope that America might become a land of justice and reason. His was a legacy of quiet courage, unwavering duty, and an unyielding belief that a republic must stand upon the rock of truth. In the green, rolling hills of Shadwell, Virginia, on a mild April morning in the year 1743, a boy was born who would one day carve his name into history with words. His name was Thomas Jefferson. Raised in the embrace of nature and books, young Thomas wandered the vast forests of his family's plantation, his curious mind devouring every page he could find. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a respected surveyor and planter, a man of land and maps, while his mother, Jane Randolph, came from one of Virginia's most prominent families. These two worlds, of rugged, earthy knowledge and refined intellectual heritage, shaped the boy's destiny. When Thomas was just 14, his father died, leaving behind not just land but an endless thirst for learning. That hunger drove him to the College of William and Mary, where the brilliance of the Enlightenment seized his soul. He read Locke's philosophy of natural rights, Newton's laws of the universe, and absorbed the writings of classical thinkers. By his early 20s, Jefferson was a practicing lawyer, a quiet, observant man with a mind like a flame. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, where his belief in liberty and self-governance began to solidify. The 1770s were a time of turmoil. As the colonies chafed under British rule, Jefferson's eloquence became a weapon. In 1776, as revolution loomed, he was chosen by the Continental Congress to draft a Declaration of Independence. In a rented room in Philadelphia, quill in hand, he gave voice to a dream. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Those words thundered across the world, igniting the hope of freedom. But even as he spoke of liberty, his own life was tangled in contradictions. Jefferson was a slave owner, a man whose grand ideals of freedom coexisted with the cruel reality of human bondage. Among those enslaved at Monticello was Sally Hemings, a woman with whom he is believed to have had several children. These shadows would follow his legacy, a painful reminder of the complexity of human nature. After the Revolution, Jefferson's talents took him to France as a diplomat. He admired the French Enlightenment, but feared the bloody chaos of their revolution. He returned to America, serving as Secretary of State under George Washington, clashing with Alexander Hamilton over the direction of the new nation. Jefferson believed in the power of the common farmer, the strength of the states over the federal government, and a nation of independent citizens rather than industrial elites. His path led to the presidency in 1800, a brutal election marred by insults and divisions. But his victory marked a peaceful transfer of power, proof that this fragile republic could endure. As president, he oversaw the Louisiana Purchase, a vast expansion that doubled the size of the United States though he wrestled with doubts about its constitutionality. Not all was triumph. His second term was troubled by the Embargo Act of 1807, a policy meant to avoid war, but which crippled American trade. Disillusioned, he retired to Monticello, where he indulged in his love for architecture, science, and education. He founded the University of Virginia, calling it the hobby of my old age, a place where the young could learn free from religious influence. In his final years, Jefferson's friendship with his old rival John Adams blossomed again. Through letters, the two giants of the Revolution shared memories, ideas, and reflections on a nation they had built. On July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson passed away. Just hours later, Adams followed him. Two lives, two visions, bound by the same dream. Thomas Jefferson's story is one of brilliance shadowed by contradiction, of noble words and flawed actions. He wrote of liberty while owning slaves, dreamed of equality while living in a world of hierarchy. Yet his words, words of freedom, of self-governance, of the rights of the individual, continue to inspire. A reminder that the quest for a more perfect union is never truly over. In the quiet countryside of Port Conway, Virginia, on a misty morning in March of 1751, a child was born who would one day draft the blueprint of a nation. His name was James Madison. Despite his small stature, barely 5 feet tall, he would become a giant of intellect and principle. Raised in the rolling fields of a tobacco plantation in Orange County, he was the eldest of 12 children in a family of means, but with a spirit of modesty and faith. From an early age, Madison's sharp mind devoured books. History, philosophy, languages. Nothing escaped his quiet curiosity. At the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, he completed his studies in just 2 years, immersing himself in the Enlightenment ideals of reason, liberty, and the rights of mankind. Unlike the fiery orators of his time, Madison was soft-spoken, a man who chose his words carefully but wielded them with power. In the turbulent 1770s, as whispers of revolution grew louder, Madison found his voice. He served in the Virginia state legislature, where he met Thomas Jefferson, a friendship that would shape both men's lives. Madison's sharp legal mind and deep commitment to democratic principles soon carried him to the Continental Congress, where he saw firsthand the fragility of the new American government under the Articles of Confederation. But Madison was not one to simply criticize. He was a builder. Arriving at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he came prepared, clutching his detailed Virginia plan, an idea for a new government that balanced power between the states and the national authority. Throughout the heated debates, Madison spoke calmly but passionately, defending the need for a strong, balanced system. His meticulous notes would become the most detailed record of the convention's debates, earning him the title Father of the Constitution. Yet he was not blind to criticism. When opponents feared that the Constitution lacked protections for personal liberties, Madison listened. As a member of the First Congress, he drafted the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments that guaranteed freedoms of speech, religion, and due process. His ability to balance strong governance with the protection of individual rights became his legacy. In 1794, Madison married Dolly Payne Todd, a lively young widow whose warmth and charm became the perfect complement to his reserved nature. While Madison was quiet and studious, Dolly's social grace and hospitality turned their home into a center of political life. When Madison became Secretary of State under Jefferson, and later the 4th President of the United States, Dolly became a beloved First Lady, her receptions easing political tensions and her courage shining even in crisis. Madison's presidency was tested by war. In 1812, the United States declared war on Britain, a conflict born from British violations of American sovereignty. The war went poorly. British troops marched into Washington, D.C., burning the White House. Dolly's bravery in saving national treasures became legendary, but Madison's leadership was questioned. Yet by 1815, when the Treaty of Ghent ended the conflict, a new sense of American pride had been born. Retiring to Montpelier, his Virginia estate, Madison spent his later years writing, farming, and reflecting on the country he had helped shape. He served as rector of the University of Virginia, working with his old friend Jefferson to inspire a new generation of thinkers. He lived long enough to see his beloved Constitution tested by rising sectional tensions. James Madison passed away on June 28, 1836, at the age of 85. His legacy was not one of fiery speeches or grand gestures, but of quiet brilliance, of patient dedication to principles that would guide a nation for centuries. He was a man who believed that true freedom was found not in chaos, but in a system of laws built with reason and debate. And in that, he succeeded. In the quiet woods of Westmoreland County, Virginia, on a soft spring morning in the year 1758, a boy was born who would one day guide a young nation through both war and peace. His name was James Monroe. Born to a modest planter and skilled carpenter, young James grew up surrounded by the dense forests and wide fields of Virginia, a place where hard work was a daily lesson. When Monroe's father passed away, he was just a teenager, but the weight of family responsibility quickly settled on his shoulders. Yet even with duties at home, his thirst for knowledge could not be quenched. He studied under the shade of tall trees, his mind wandering through the pages of books, dreaming of a world beyond his rural home. Eventually, he secured a place at the College of William and Mary, where the whispers of revolution were already stirring. At just 18, he put aside his studies, answering the call to arms for the cause of liberty. Monroe joined the 3rd Virginia Regiment of the Continental Army, a young soldier marching under the watchful eye of General George Washington. He fought at the Battle of Trenton, where a musket ball tore through his shoulder, during the daring Christmas night crossing of the icy Delaware River. His bravery and resilience earned the respect of his fellow soldiers, and though his wound would scar, it became a badge of his unwavering dedication. After the war, Monroe returned to Virginia, his dreams no longer those of a young farmer, but of a statesman. He studied law under the guidance of Thomas Jefferson, the towering thinker whose words had declared American independence. Jefferson's mentorship shaped Monroe's mind, and their friendship would last a lifetime. Monroe stepped into the world of politics, first as a delegate to the Continental Congress, then helping to draft Virginia's new Constitution. Monroe's diplomatic talents soon took him abroad. As America's envoy to France, he was embraced by the French people, who saw in him a true friend to their own struggle for liberty. Yet his warm ties with France drew criticism at home, where Federalists accused him of being too sympathetic to revolutionary causes. But Monroe believed in the power of friendship among nations. Under President James Madison, Monroe's talents became even more vital. He served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of War during the War of 1812, the only person in American history to hold both posts at once. As British forces burned Washington, Monroe helped rally American defenses, guiding strategy and restoring shattered confidence. His leadership helped the nation endure, and by the time peace was restored, Monroe was a hero. When the time came for a new president, the choice was clear. In 1817, Monroe became the 5th President of the United States, ushering in an era known as the era of good feelings. He traveled across the nation, shaking hands with farmers, veterans, and townsfolk, listening to their hopes and fears. His presence brought a sense of unity to a country still finding its identity. But Monroe's greatest legacy came in 1823, when he delivered a message to Congress that would echo through centuries. In his address, he declared that the American continents were no longer open to European colonization, a bold proclamation that became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Though largely crafted by his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, it carried Monroe's vision, a vision of American independence and leadership in the New World. His presidency also saw the acquisition of Florida from Spain and the delicate balance of the Missouri Compromise, which sought to maintain peace between free and slave states. Monroe, a slaveholder himself, struggled with the moral contradictions of his time. He believed in the strength of the Union, but lived in a world where freedom was not shared equally. After 2 terms, Monroe retired to his Virginia estate, facing financial troubles that plagued many former presidents. His beloved wife, Elizabeth, passed away in 1830, and Monroe, now aged and weary, moved to New York City to live with his daughter. There, on July 4th, 1831, 5 years to the day after the deaths of his friends Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, Monroe passed away. James Monroe was the last of the founding fathers to serve as president, a man who had fought in the Revolution, served as a diplomat, and led a young nation in times of challenge and change. His doctrine of American strength and independence became a guiding star for future generations. And his life, marked by quiet courage and steady leadership, remains a testament to the enduring power of unity. John Quincy Adams was born on July 11, 1767, in a small saltbox house in Braintree, Massachusetts, at the heart of America's revolutionary fervor. His father, John Adams, would later become the second President of the United States, and his mother, Abigail Adams, was a woman of remarkable intellect and unwavering moral guidance. From the very beginning, young John Quincy was not just born into privilege, but into a life shaped by purpose, duty, and the unfolding of a nation's destiny. As a child, John Quincy had the rare privilege of witnessing the American Revolution firsthand. He stood on a hill and watched the chaos of the Battle of Bunker Hill, absorbing the weight of what his country was fighting for. He traveled across Europe with his father, who was a diplomat, and met towering figures like Catherine the Great and Benjamin Franklin. These early experiences shaped him into someone who saw the world with a broader vision and an understanding of its complexities, long before he was old enough to vote. Despite his family's prominence, John Quincy's life was never one of luxury. He was a man driven by ideas and ideals, not by the allure of power. Fluent in multiple languages by adolescence, he immersed himself in the world's great intellectual traditions, studying at European academies and later attending Harvard University. By the time he was just 14, John Quincy began working as secretary to the American envoy in Russia, a remarkable diplomatic role for someone so young. At 26, he was appointed U.S. Minister to the Netherlands, and shortly thereafter to Prussia. His diplomatic talents were so widely recognized that even George Washington, the first President of the United States, praised him as the ablest of all our young men. His education was that of a prince, yet his mission was always about something much larger, the Republic. In 1793, Adams was elected to the U.S. Senate representing Massachusetts. Although he was a Federalist by party, John Quincy was not beholden to any political faction. He followed his conscience, even when it put him at odds with his own party. A prime example of this was his support of Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, which infuriated the Federalists. For Adams, it was not about popularity, but about principle. And this independent streak earned him a reputation as a political maverick, someone whose vision was driven by ideals, not by personal ambition. Soon after, under President James Madison, Adams served as U.S. Minister to Russia and later to Britain, where he played a pivotal role in negotiating the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. His diplomatic work helped restore America's standing on the world stage, guiding the young nation through a period of immense challenges. In President James Monroe's administration, Adams served as Secretary of State, where his legacy truly began to take shape. It was during this time that he orchestrated the Adams-Honest Treaty, which secured Florida from Spain and set the U.S. borders with Spanish territories to the west. He believed in the importance of internal improvements and the expansion of American commerce, advocating for a robust and growing republic. Yet it was the Monroe Doctrine, though it bore Monroe's name, that became his most lasting contribution. It was Adams who crafted this bold policy, declaring that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization. It was a clear message that the Western Hemisphere was now the domain of the New World, forever altering the global balance of power. In 1824, John Quincy Adams ran for president in a contentious election that saw Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford as his rivals. Though Jackson won the popular vote, no candidate secured a majority in the Electoral College, and the decision was left to the House of Representatives. With Clay's support, Adams was chosen, and he became the 6th President of the United States. However, his presidency was immediately marred by accusations of a corrupt bargain, and from the start, he faced deep suspicion. Despite this, Adams pressed forward with ambitious plans to build national universities, create scientific institutions, and expand the nation's transportation network. He envisioned a future where America was connected by roads, canals, and the free exchange of ideas. But the Jacksonian opposition in Congress thwarted many of his goals. His presidency, marked by brilliant ideas and frustrating obstacles, became a period of unrealized potential. After losing the presidency to Andrew Jackson in 1828, many would have expected Adams to fade into retirement. But instead, he embarked on a remarkable second act. In 1831, Adams was elected to the House of Representatives, becoming the only former president to ever serve in Congress. It was here that he found his truest voice. For 17 years, Adams fought tirelessly against slavery, championing the abolitionist cause with unmatched passion. He became known as Old Man Eloquent, his speeches in Congress filled with conviction and moral clarity. One of his greatest battles was against the gag rule, which prevented anti-slavery petitions from being read in the House. He fought tirelessly to give a voice to the voiceless, and his persistence became a symbol of moral leadership in a time of deep national division. Perhaps his most famous moment came in 1841, when he argued before the Supreme Court on behalf of a group of enslaved Africans who had seized control of the ship Amistad after being illegally trafficked. Even in his later years, frail and weakened, Adams stood in court for 4 hours, passionately defending their right to freedom. His victory in the case was not just a triumph of law, but of human rights, a victory for justice over oppression. On February 21st, 1848, while speaking on the floor of the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams collapsed at his desk. He was carried to the Speaker's room, and 2 days later passed away. His final words were, "This is the last of earth. I am content." He had served his country for over 50 years, across 3 continents and 6 presidencies. though his time as president was short. His legacy as a moral force in American politics remains unmatched. John Quincy Adams was not a populist, nor a war hero. He was not the most beloved man of his time, but he was brilliant, principled, and unwavering. His belief in education, diplomacy, justice, and truth defined his life and his service. He believed America could be better, not just larger, richer, or more powerful, but more just and more free. And though his presidency was marked by frustration, his commitment to the ideals of liberty, governance, and moral leadership continues to inspire. Imagine, if you will, a man, aged and bent, walking the halls of Congress, never silenced by the weight of time or the opposition he faced. Picture him standing before the Supreme Court, defending the rights of enslaved people with a trembling voice, but an iron will. Picture a young boy, watching the revolution unfold before his eyes, and a man who, even at the end of his life, never stopped fighting for the promise of that revolution. Because John Quincy Adams believed in duty beyond office, in truth above power, and in the enduring pursuit of a more perfect union. His life reminds us that the struggle for justice is a lifelong commitment, one that transcends the office held and the years past. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767, in a small settlement on the border of North and South Carolina. His childhood was marked by poverty, hardship, and the echoes of rebellion. His father died before he was born, and by the time he was 14, Andrew had lost his mother and 2 brothers to the ravages of the American Revolutionary War. These early losses were a heavy burden, but they shaped him into a man of strength, anger, and unstoppable will. At a young age, Jackson was captured by the British and beaten by an officer for refusing to polish his boots, a scar that would stay with him forever. This early trauma hardened him. It made him resilient, a person who would stop at nothing to win, with a relentless determination. Jackson studied law in North Carolina, and then rode west to Nashville, Tennessee. There, he built a successful legal practice and earned a reputation for being both brilliant and brutal. He was quick-tempered and quicker with a pistol. In Nashville, he met Rachel Donaldson, a woman whose complicated divorce led to scandal and whispers. Despite the controversy, they married, and Jackson adored her with fiery, lifelong devotion. His legal career brought him influence, but it was war that would bring him fame. During the War of 1812, Jackson commanded U.S. forces against both Native American tribes and the British. His relentless pursuit of victory earned him the nickname Old Hickory. As tough and unyielding as the tree itself, in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, he defeated the Creek Nation, opening vast territories to American settlers. Shortly after, he achieved one of the most remarkable victories in U.S. history at the Battle of New Orleans, where his ragtag army defeated a seasoned British force with minimal casualties. He became a national hero, the embodiment of frontier defiance. After the war, Jackson led military campaigns in Spanish Florida, clashing with Seminole tribes and executing foreign agents, sparking a diplomatic uproar. His boldness led to the Adams-Onis Treaty, which ceded Florida to the U.S. He served briefly as its governor before returning to Tennessee. But behind the victories lay a darker legacy. Jackson's policies toward Native Americans, rooted in a vision of American expansion, would later define one of the most painful chapters in U.S. history. In 1824, Jackson ran for president against John Quincy Adams, winning the popular vote but losing in the House of Representatives. Enraged, he decried the corrupt bargain that gave Adams the presidency and vowed revenge. In 1828, Jackson ran again, and this time he won, becoming the 7th President of the United States and the first to rise from humble origins. To many, he became the champion of the common man, but to others, he was a populist tyrant. What all agreed upon, however, was that Jackson would not be ignored. Jackson's presidency, from 1829 to 1837, ushered in a new era of American democracy. He expanded suffrage for white men, attacked the entrenched political elite, and positioned himself as the voice of the people. He wielded the presidential veto like a weapon, famously killing the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as a corrupt tool of the wealthy. "I was born for a storm, and a calm does not suit me," he once said. And indeed his presidency was a tempest. Perhaps the most controversial and tragic act of Jackson's presidency was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. He believed Native American nations had no place within the growing U.S. and pushed policies that forced them westward, despite opposition and a Supreme Court ruling in Worcester v. Georgia that sided with the Cherokee. Jackson pressed on. The result was the Trail of Tears, a forced migration that led to the suffering and death of thousands. It remains a stain on his legacy that cannot be ignored. Jackson also faced down a crisis of secession years before the Civil War, when South Carolina threatened to nullify federal tariffs and break from the Union. Jackson responded firmly, warning that disunion by armed force is treason, and he sent troops to enforce the law. A compromise diffused the crisis, and Jackson preserved the Union, but the tensions that would later erupt into war had been revealed. Jackson retired in 1837 to the Hermitage, his Tennessee plantation. There he wrote letters, welcomed visitors, and watched the country he helped shape continue to evolve. He mourned Rachel, who had died before he took office, and remained devoted to her memory. He died on June 8, 1845, surrounded by family and friends. His last words were, "Be good children, all of you, and strive to be ready when the change comes." Andrew Jackson's legacy is one of contradiction. He expanded democracy while denying it to many. He strengthened the presidency while defying the Supreme Court. He was a hero to some and a villain to others, but he changed the office, the nation, and the very meaning of what it was to be an American. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, imagine a man on horseback, silhouetted by cannon fire, sword raised high. Picture that same man standing alone in the Oval Office, resolute, unbending, braced against the storm. He was flawed. He was fierce. He was a force. Because Andrew Jackson believed the people should rule, the presidency became a pulpit, and the nation a battlefield of ideals. Martin Van Buren was a master of quiet strategy, a tactician whose understanding of the delicate dance of politics was unmatched. Born in the heart of New York, he had a sharp mind that saw beyond the immediate and into the heart of what made America's government tick. His political rise wasn't by chance. It was a series of deliberate moves, each calculated to strengthen the fragile union that was still finding its feet. Imagine him not as a fiery populist like his predecessor Andrew Jackson, but as a calm, steady hand guiding the ship of state through treacherous waters. Martin Van Buren's presidency was not defined by grand speeches or sweeping gestures, but by his quiet maneuvering and his ability to keep a fractured nation together. In an era when politics was more about passion and power struggles than ever before, Van Buren saw himself as a conductor of democracy, someone who could maintain harmony in a nation that was anything but harmonious. His time as the 8th President of the United States was marked by economic hardship, but he believed in the idea that the Republic could endure, if only it could be kept true to its founding principles. He didn't just see politics as a game for the elite. To him, it was an art. Van Buren's vision was about creating a more responsive, more democratic America, where the voices of the people would be heard above the clamoring interests of the powerful few. His ability to read the political landscape and act accordingly made him a force in Washington, even if his actions weren't always praised in the moment. One of his key achievements was the creation of the modern Democratic Party. While Jackson had been the face of populist rebellion, Van Buren was the strategist behind it all, crafting a party that could compete with the powerful political machinery of the time. His deep understanding of the needs of the common people allowed him to organize and consolidate political forces in ways that would have been unthinkable without him. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Van Buren inherited the economic consequences of Jackson's policies, especially the Panic of 1837. Under his leadership, the country faced financial ruin, with banks failing and unemployment soaring. Still, Van Buren remained resolute, trying to manage the crisis through policies that promoted a strong, independent economy. But they didn't always have the intended effect. Yet, even in the face of economic despair, he never lost sight of his ultimate goal, preserving the Union. Van Buren knew that politics could shape the future, and his calm demeanor, sharp intellect, and masterful diplomacy helped hold the country together in some of its most trying times. His presidency may not have been marked by dramatic military victories or transformative legislation, but his behind-the-scenes work laid the groundwork for the stability and continuity that would follow. Picture him now in the quiet of his study, a fine coat draped over his shoulders, his hand steady on the pen as he writes strategies that move nations. The country, at a crossroads, relied on his diplomacy to steer it through. At dawn, he sips his coffee and pores over letters from all parts of the nation, crafting alliances, pushing forward ideas, and ensuring that the fragile union he worked to protect would endure. Martin Van Buren may not have been the loudest voice in American history, but his legacy is undeniable. His vision for a more democratic, responsive republic shaped the nation in ways that still echo today. As you drift into dreams, imagine a man with the power to quietly weave a tapestry of policies that held a nation together in its most delicate moments. Because Martin Van Buren knew that politics was not just about power. It was about creating a country that could endure and thrive, no matter the storms it faced. William Henry Harrison's story begins on February 9th, 1773, in the heart of Charles City County, Virginia. A baby boy was born into the thick of the American Revolution, destined to make his own mark on the young nation. Named William Henry Harrison, he hailed from a distinguished Virginia family, with his father, Benjamin Harrison I, being a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Raised in a world shaped by the ideals of liberty and the reverberations of revolution, William grew up carrying the weight of his family's legacy and the expectations of those around him. Although originally destined to pursue a career in medicine, fate had other plans for Harrison. In 1791, he joined the U.S. Army, where his courage and leadership quickly set him apart. Serving under General Anthony Wayne in the Northwest Indian War, Harrison earned recognition for his role in securing American control over the Northwest Territory. His bravery earned him promotions, and soon he became one of the most prominent figures in the frontier. Harrison's personal life was marked by his marriage to Anna Tuthill Sims, the daughter of a respected judge. Together, they had 10 children. Yet, it was his role as governor of the Indiana Territory that cemented his place in American history. Harrison's time as governor was controversial due to his dealings with Native American tribes, many of which were fraught with tension. These tensions culminated in the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where Harrison led U.S. forces to victory against the Confederation of Native American tribes led by Tecumseh. The battle earned Harrison the nickname Tippecanoe, a symbol of his resilience and leadership on the frontier. During the War of 1812, Harrison's fame grew as he commanded U.S. forces in the Northwest. His victory at the Battle of the Thames, where he defeated British troops and their Native American allies, secured the region for the United States and solidified his reputation as a national hero. However, after the war, Harrison retired to his farm in North Bend, Ohio. Yet, the lure of politics proved too strong. Harrison served as a congressman, senator, and even as a minister to Columbia, always advocating for Western expansion and veterans' rights. He wasn't a man of grand speeches or dramatic political maneuvers. but rather a man of quiet duty and service, often acting with a sense of responsibility and a desire to serve the nation. As tensions between the North and South over slavery and states' rights escalated, Harrison emerged as a unifying figure, a war hero without heavy political ties. In 1840, the newly formed Whig Party selected him as their presidential candidate to run against the incumbent, Martin Van Buren. The Whigs ran a masterful campaign, portraying Harrison as a humble frontiersman who lived in a log cabin, drank hard cider, and spoke for the common man. This image, though somewhat far from the truth, Harrison came from privilege, captured the imagination of the public. With slogans, songs, and parades, the campaign brought excitement to the voters, and Harrison won in a landslide. On March 4th, 1841, Harrison was sworn in as the 9th President of the United States at the age of 68, the oldest person to ever hold the office at that time. Determined to appear strong and vigorous, he delivered a 2-hour inaugural address, the longest in U.S. history, in freezing rain, without a coat or hat. A month later, he was dead. Harrison fell ill just weeks into his presidency, initially thought to have contracted pneumonia, though recent studies suggest it was typhoid fever caused by contaminated water near the White House. He died on April 4th, 1841, just 31 days after taking office, marking the shortest presidency in U.S. history. Harrison's death left a lasting impact on the nation, setting a crucial constitutional precedent. Vice President John Tyler immediately assumed the full powers of the presidency, establishing the rule of presidential succession that remains in place today. Though his presidency was incredibly brief, Harrison's passing sparked widespread shock and debate. However, it also unified the country in grief. He was remembered not for the potential of his presidency, but for his lifetime of military valor, public service, and quiet humility. He had lived a full life, and his death at the pinnacle of public trust only solidified his place in history. Though his presidency was brief, its effects rippled through the years. His grandson, Benjamin Harrison, would later become the 23rd President of the United States. Harrison's campaign style also helped usher in the era of modern electioneering, using slogans and imagery that would dominate future elections. His sudden death also clarified the ambiguity in the Constitution regarding presidential succession, creating a rule that would guide the nation in future crises. He was not a philosopher or a visionary, but rather a soldier, a father, and a reluctant politician who answered the call when needed. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, imagine a man in a log cabin sipping cider, with a saber from Tippecanoe hanging above the hearth. Picture him riding into the rain on Inauguration Day, proud and hopeful, unaware that history would remember him more for how briefly he stood than how long he fought. William Henry Harrison believed in duty above comfort, and he gave it his all, even if for just 1 month. In the cool spring of 1790, beneath the vast skies of Charles City County, Virginia, a child was born to a world of heritage and expectation. His name was John Tyler, and from his earliest days, his life seemed destined to dance on the stage of American history. Raised in a family where politics flowed as naturally as the James River beside them, Tyler absorbed the ideals of liberty and governance like air. His father, John Tyler S.R., was a towering figure, a judge, a governor, a trusted ally of Thomas Jefferson. In such an environment, young John's mind was a forge, where the iron of tradition met the fire of revolutionary thought. By 17, he had graduated from the College of William and Mary, and by 19, he was already a lawyer. But the courtroom was not enough for his restless spirit. Politics called, and Tyler answered. He ascended the ladder swiftly. From the Virginia legislature to the U.S. House of Representatives, then on to the Senate, he was a man of principle, a fierce advocate for states' rights, wary of any encroachment by federal power. He often found himself standing alone, voting against his own party when conscience demanded it. Independence was both his strength and his curse. Initially a Democrat, Tyler grew disillusioned with Andrew Jackson's forceful style of governance. His belief in state sovereignty over federal dominance clashed with Jacksonian power. So he broke ranks, joining the Whig Party, a strange alliance, but one born of necessity. His peers may have seen a man of contradictions, but in his own eyes, he was a guardian of the Republic's founding principles. In 1840, Tyler's life took an unexpected turn. The Whigs needed a Southern statesman to balance their ticket, alongside the war hero William Henry Harrison. Tyler was the answer, and the campaign swept the nation with log cabins, cider barrels, and the rousing chant of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Harrison's victory seemed a triumph, but fate had other plans. Just 31 days after his inauguration, Harrison was dead. Panic gripped Washington. Was Tyler merely an acting president or the president himself? Tyler's answer was unyielding. He took the oath, moved into the White House, and declared himself fully and unequivocally the President of the United States. Critics mocked him as his accidency, but his resolve set a critical precedent, the seamless transition of power. Yet the stability he brought was not without conflict. Tyler's independent spirit quickly clashed with the Whig Party's leadership. He vetoed their bill to re-establish a national bank, enraging party leaders and provoking mass resignations from his cabinet. The Whigs expelled him, making him a president without a party, a leader surrounded by foes. But Tyler was no stranger to isolation. He persisted, turning his focus to foreign policy. He secured the Webster-Rashburton Treaty, which settled long-standing border disputes with Britain. He opened diplomatic relations with China, sending American ships to distant shores. And most significantly, he championed the annexation of Texas, a move that expanded American territory but also deepened the nation's growing divide over slavery. Even in his personal life, Tyler's journey was marked by both joy and sorrow. His beloved wife Letitia passed away while he was in office, the first lady to die in the White House. A year later, Tyler stunned the Capitol by marrying Julia Gardner, a spirited socialite 30 years his junior. Together, they would have 7 children, adding to the 8 he had with Letitia. In total, Tyler fathered 15 children, a record unmatched among American presidents. As his presidency neared its end, Tyler pushed relentlessly for the annexation of Texas. Despite fierce opposition, he secured a joint resolution of Congress, ensuring Texas would join the Union. It was a final act of defiance and ambition. After leaving the presidency, Tyler retired to his Sherwood Forest plantation. But his story did not end there. When Southern states seceded in 1861, his loyalty lay with his native Virginia. He opposed war, but ultimately joined the Confederate Congress, the only former U.S. president to take such a step. He died in 1862, a man divided in legacy. In the North, his death was scarcely noted. In the South, he was honored as a defender of their cause. John Tyler was a president who was never meant to be. Yet his story is one of resolve and defiance. He was a man who challenged his own party, redefined the presidency, and left a legacy of constitutional clarity. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, imagine a solitary figure walking the echoing halls of the White House. A man doubted but undeterred. Because John Tyler believed in the Constitution above all else, the presidency endured, even when the world was unsure. In the chill of a November night in 1795, in a rough log cabin nestled in Pineville, North Carolina, a child drew his first breath. His name was James Knox Polk, a name that would one day be etched into the annals of American history. His world was one of frontier hardship and quiet determination. His parents, Samuel and Jane Polk, were Scots-Irish settlers whose faith and ambition shaped young James's early life. Sickly as a child, Polk endured relentless pain, his thin frame often bent beneath the weight of illness. At 17, he underwent a brutal surgery without anesthesia, a crude operation that left him scarred but alive. Yet from that agony, he emerged with a steely resilience. His mother instilled in him a deep sense of faith, while his father sparked in him an ambition that burned brighter with each passing year. Polk's sharp mind carried him to the University of North Carolina, where he excelled in debate, graduating with honors. Law beckoned, and soon he apprenticed under the formidable Felix Grundy in Tennessee. But it was politics that captured his soul. By his early 20s, Polk had already won a seat in the Tennessee legislature, his stern, methodical manner setting him apart. A loyal disciple of Andrew Jackson, Polk embraced the ideals of the Democratic Party: limited government, expansionism, and the empowerment of the common man. His fierce dedication and keen intellect saw him rise swiftly through the ranks of national politics. Elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1825, He would serve there for 14 years, eventually becoming Speaker of the House, the only president in American history to hold that role. But his career was not without hardship. After a brief and troubled stint as governor of Tennessee, Polk seemed destined for obscurity. His bid for re-election failed twice, his name fading from the national stage. Yet history has a way of turning in unexpected moments. In 1844, as the Democratic National Convention deadlocked, Polk's name emerged as a compromise, a dark horse candidate, little known but well connected. He seized the moment, riding a wave of populism and expansionist fervor. Polk's campaign promised to annex Texas, secure Oregon, and acquire California. A vision of an America stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Against the odds, he won. And when he entered the White House in 1845, he did so with a singular focus: to fulfill every promise he had made. Polk was relentless. He slashed tariffs, reestablished the independent treasury system, and negotiated the Oregon boundary with Britain, securing the 49th parallel without a war. But it was the Southwest that would define his presidency. When tensions with Mexico over Texas flared into violence, Polk's determination never wavered. The Mexican-American War began, a conflict that would redraw the map of North America. Under his command, U.S. forces marched into Mexico City itself, a stunning display of American military power. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 granted the United States a vast new territory, more than 500,000 square miles, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado. But Polk's victories were not without a price. His expansionism deepened the divide over slavery, a bitter conflict that would later ignite the Civil War. Even as he reshaped the nation, he sowed the seeds of its greatest crisis. True to his word, Polk did not seek re-election. Exhausted by the relentless pace of his presidency, he returned to Tennessee, his health failing. On June 15, 1849, just 3 months after leaving office, he died at the age of 53. His wife, Sarah Childress Polk, would guard his legacy for another 4 decades. James K. Polk was a man of action, a president who achieved every goal he set. Yet his relentless drive carried a cost, for himself and for the nation he sought to expand. He was a man who saw a continent not for what it was, but for what it could become. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, imagine a man bent over a map, his fingers tracing mountains and rivers, his mind plotting a vision of a nation that stretched from sea to sea. Because James K. Polk believed that destiny was something you seized, not something you waited for. In the fading light of a crisp November day in 1784, a child came into the world within the rough walls of a log cabin in Orange County, Virginia. His name was Zachary Taylor. His family soon moved west, settling near the winding waters of the Ohio River in Kentucky. There, among the untamed forests and rugged terrain, young Zachary grew up not with books, but with the smell of gunpowder, the roar of storms, and the silent patience of frontier life. Taylor was a boy of sinew and spirit, more at home on horseback than in a classroom. His education was brief, little more than letters and sums, but he learned other lessons: how to read the sky for weather, how to hunt for food, and how to keep his word. In a land where survival meant courage, Taylor's character was forged early. In 1808, he joined the United States Army, not out of any grand ambition, but because duty seemed as natural to him as the changing seasons. His military career began modestly, a young lieutenant facing the perils of frontier warfare. But the years would turn him into a veteran of some of America's fiercest conflicts. The War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the brutal struggle of the Second Seminole War. Through it all, he was a soldier's soldier, plain-spoken, steady, and utterly fearless. But it was in the Mexican-American War that Taylor's name rose to legendary heights, commanding his troops at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. He won victories that carried his reputation far beyond the smoke of battle. Yet it was the fierce clash at Buena Vista that truly etched his name into history. Vastly outnumbered by a Mexican force under General Santa Anna, Taylor's men stood their ground, their commander's resolve as unyielding as the rocky hills around them. When Washington asked if he would retreat, Taylor's reply was simple: "I shall win or die." And he won. His soldiers called him Old Rough and Ready, a name that matched his unpolished manner and his habit of leading from the front. He shared their hardships, their hunger, their cold. Around campfires, men spoke of him as one of their own. In a country weary of political bickering, such a man became a symbol, a hero who put action before words. In 1848, the Whig Party saw their chance. Though Taylor had never voted in an election, had no clear political ideology, and had once declared he wasn't sure which party he belonged to, they nominated him for president. His fame did the rest. Americans, tired of empty promises, rallied behind the battle-hardened general who had always kept his word. He won, becoming the 12th President of the United States. But the White House was no battlefield. Taylor soon found himself facing a new kind of conflict: the seething debate over slavery and the future of new territories gained from Mexico. Despite being a slaveholder himself, he opposed the expansion of slavery into these new lands, believing that the Union must come first. Southern leaders were stunned. Here was a man of the South who defied them. Yet his presidency was not to last. On a sweltering 4th of July in 1850, after attending a long ceremony under the scorching sun, Taylor returned to the White House. He ate raw fruit, drank cold milk, and soon fell violently ill. Within 5 days, he was dead. Some whispered of poisoning, but history would record his death as the result of acute gastroenteritis. Zachary Taylor was the second American president to die in office, his term lasting barely 16 months. But even in death, his legend remained. He was a man who never sought greatness but found it, on battlefields, in the hearts of his men, and in the brief moment when he stood as the nation's leader. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, imagine a dusty soldier, coat undone, sword resting against a tree, staring at the endless horizon. Picture a man who never spoke of honor but lived it, who never sought power but held it, because Zachary Taylor believed in doing what was right, not what was easy, and for that, history remembers him. On a bitter winter night in early January of the year 1800, in a modest log cabin nestled among the snow-laden hills of Cayuga County, New York, a boy was born into a world of hardship and perseverance. His name was Millard Fillmore. The world he entered was one of simplicity, with rough-hewn walls that offered little protection from the biting wind, and a hearth that struggled to warm the small room. His father, Nathaniel Fillmore, was a tenant farmer, a man who tilled the stubborn earth but reaped meager harvests. For young Millard, life was a constant reminder of poverty's sharp edges. Education was a luxury in such a place, but for Millard, it became an obsession. There were no libraries in those hills, no tutors to guide him. Yet he found knowledge wherever he could. He borrowed books, studied by the faint light of a fireplace, and read anything that came his way. His mother, Phoebe Millard Fillmore, nurtured his hunger for learning, while his father taught him the value of labor, honesty, and resilience. His thirst for knowledge set him apart from his peers. A quiet boy with a fierce determination hidden beneath his gentle demeanor. As a teenager, Millard was apprenticed to a cloth maker, a trade his father believed would give him stability. But Millard's heart remained with his books, and soon he found a mentor in Judge Walter Wood, who recognized the boy's sharp mind and introduced him to the study of law. Sacrificing sleep, comfort, and any semblance of leisure, Millard worked by day and studied by night. Finally, in his 20s, he qualified as a lawyer, establishing a practice in Buffalo, New York. The city was rough, its streets muddy, its buildings modest, but for Fillmore it was a place of promise. Buffalo transformed Fillmore. He gained a reputation for his integrity, meticulous nature, and quiet courtesy. His words were measured, his actions thoughtful. He married Abigail Powers, a schoolteacher with a mind as sharp as his own, and together they built a home filled with books, learning, and mutual respect. It was a partnership of intellect and quiet affection. Fillmore's rise in politics was a testament to his character. Elected to the New York State Assembly in his late 20s, he became known for his advocacy of education and internal improvements. In the United States House of Representatives, where he served multiple terms, he supported tariffs that protected American industry, pushed for the creation of an independent treasury, and promoted modern infrastructure like roads and canals. Yet Fillmore was no firebrand. He was a man of moderation, a believer in reasoned compromise over passionate rhetoric. This disposition earned him respect, but also criticism. In the fractious world of antebellum American politics, A calm demeanor could be mistaken for weakness. Still, his steady approach brought him influence. When the Whig Party nominated war hero Zachary Taylor for the presidency in 1848, they needed a Northern moderate to balance the ticket. Fillmore was their choice. He was the quiet counterbalance to Taylor's blunt, rugged image. Together, they won the election. As vice president, Fillmore was largely sidelined. His counsel rarely sought. But fate would soon thrust him into the spotlight. In July of 1850, President Taylor died unexpectedly, and the weight of the nation fell upon Fillmore's shoulders. The country he inherited was a powder keg. The question of slavery in the newly acquired Western territories threatened to tear the Union apart. Southern states spoke of secession. Congress was a battlefield of heated words and clashing wills. Fillmore's presidency would be defined by the Compromise of 1850, a series of laws meant to calm the storm. California entered the Union as a free state. The slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C., but slavery itself remained untouched. The territories of Utah and New Mexico were left to decide their own fate regarding slavery. But the most controversial piece was the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens in free states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. Fillmore believed the compromise would save the Union. He signed it with a heavy heart, convinced that peace was worth the price. But the North viewed him as a traitor to freedom, while the South saw him as unreliable. His popularity plummeted. The Whig Party, already divided, began to disintegrate. After losing his bid for re-election, Fillmore retired to Buffalo, but he did not fade away. He became a beloved civic leader, founding libraries, serving on hospital boards, and helping to rebuild the city after a devastating fire. His beloved Abigail passed away, and later he remarried Caroline Carmichael, a well-read widow who shared his quiet love of books. Millard Fillmore died on March 8, 1874, at the age of 74. By then, the Civil War had come and gone, and the compromise he once hoped would save the Union had only delayed its reckoning. Today, he is remembered with complexity, a man of quiet words in a world of fierce passions, a lawyer turned president who sought peace, but became a symbol of division. As you close your eyes and drift into dreams, imagine a quiet house in Buffalo, a flickering candle, and an old man reading by its glow, still searching for understanding, even in his final days. On a crisp autumn morning, November 23, 1804, in the quiet town of Hillsborough, New Hampshire, a child's cry rose beneath the cold gray sky. His name was Franklin Pierce, a boy who would one day rise from this modest world to the highest office in the land. Yet the warmth in his young smile and the easy grace in his manner gave little hint of the shadows that would one day cloud his life. Pierce was born to Benjamin Pierce, a rugged veteran of the Revolutionary War who would twice serve as governor of New Hampshire. The elder Pierce was a man of strength and discipline, a figure who seemed carved from the granite hills around them. Young Franklin grew up in a household where service to the Republic was more than an ideal. It was a duty. But where his father was stern, Franklin was gentle. His charm was effortless, his laughter warm, and his heart easily touched. At Bowdoin College, Franklin formed a lifelong friendship with Nathaniel Hawthorne, the future literary giant. The two young men were different in many ways. Hawthorne, introspective and solemn; Pierce, sociable and radiant. But they found in each other a quiet understanding. It was here that Franklin's talent for oratory and persuasion began to shine. He could hold a room's attention with his soft but sincere voice, and his earnest eyes made even his opponents listen. By his mid-20s, Franklin Pierce's rise was swift. Elected to the New Hampshire legislature, then to the U.S. House of Representatives, and later the Senate, he became the youngest member of that august body. Yet for all his ambition, he remained humble, his manner gentle, his loyalty unshakable. It was during these early years that he married Jane Means Appleton, a delicate, deeply religious woman who loved him, but feared the world of politics. Their marriage was a union of opposites: Franklin, the vibrant, sociable public servant; Jane, the quiet, anxious soul who found little joy in Washington's crowded halls. For her, politics was a dark shadow, a world of constant anxiety. For Franklin, her sadness was a weight he could never fully lift. In 1846, as the United States declared war on Mexico, Pierce volunteered to serve. Mocked by some as a mere politician in uniform, he proved his courage in battle, leading his men with steady resolve even after suffering a painful injury. To his men, he was not just an officer. He was a comrade who shared their hardships. But even victory brought little joy. Pierce returned home a hero, but the quiet of New Hampshire seemed darker now. Politics called again in 1852, when the Democratic National Convention, deadlocked and desperate, turned to him, a compromise candidate, a man who offended few but inspired enough. To the surprise of many, he won, becoming the 14th President of the United States. But the triumph soon turned to tragedy. Only weeks before his inauguration, Franklin, Jane, and their son Benjamin were in a train accident. The car derailed, and young Benny, just 11, was killed before their eyes. Jane was shattered, retreating into a grief so deep it seemed to swallow her. Franklin, broken-hearted, entered the White House not as a victor, but as a man cloaked in sorrow. His presidency, which began with a promise of unity, soon unraveled. His support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty, only deepened the nation's divisions. Violence broke out in Kansas. Neighbor fought neighbor, and the blood of the innocent stained the land. Pierce's dream of peace was consumed by chaos. To the north, he was a traitor for enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, which required the return of escaped slaves even from free states. To the south, he was a weak ally, unable to fully protect their interests. His vision of union seemed to blind him to the growing moral crisis. Rejected by his party in 1856, Pierce returned to New Hampshire a defeated man. Jane remained cloaked in grief until her death in 1863. Franklin, isolated and heartbroken, found solace only in his letters to Nathaniel Hawthorne. As the Civil War tore the country apart, he criticized Lincoln's strong use of presidential power, and even old allies turned away. On October 8, 1869, Franklin Pierce passed away in Concord, New Hampshire, his life a portrait of unfulfilled promise. He is remembered not as a great president, but as a man whose kindness and hope were crushed by the weight of a fractured nation. Yet behind the failure was a soul that loved fiercely, a husband who mourned, a friend who cared, a leader who tried to heal a nation that would not be healed. And as the years passed, and history's judgment settled like dust, his name became a whisper, his legacy a quiet sadness, a reminder that even the gentle can be broken when the world is unkind. On a crisp spring morning of April 23rd, 1791, in the rustic surroundings of a log cabin nestled in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, a child was born who would one day stand at the helm of a fracturing nation. James Buchanan entered the world as the son of a frontier merchant and farmer, destined to become a figure of remarkable contradictions. A man of refined elegance who would remain the only bachelor to ever occupy the White House, and the final president to govern before America erupted into the bloodiest conflict of its history. Raised amid the prosperity of his Scotch-Irish family, young Buchanan displayed an early aptitude for learning that carried him to Dickinson College. There he cultivated a curious duality that would define his character, a reputation for mischievous behavior paired with undeniable intellectual brilliance. After completing his education and pursuing legal studies, he established a practice in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where his meticulous attention to detail and commanding presence quickly elevated him among the Commonwealth's most distinguished attorneys. Yet the courtroom alone could not contain Buchanan's ambitions. The siren call of political life beckoned, and he answered with eager determination. Before reaching 30 years of age, he secured a position in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, marking the beginning of a public service career that would span more than 4 decades. Soon after, he transitioned to the national stage, serving 10 formidable years in the United States House of Representatives. Initially aligned with Federalist principles, Buchanan later embraced democratic ideologies, demonstrating the political flexibility that would characterize his approach to governance. In personal bearing, Buchanan cut an impressive figure, tall and dignified, invariably dressed in impeccable attire that reflected his precision in all matters. His measured speech and diplomatic temperament made him a Washington fixture, respected even by those who disagreed with his policies. His complete devotion to public service came at a profound personal cost, however. Once engaged to Anne Coleman, a romance that promised domestic happiness, Buchanan experienced devastating heartbreak when the relationship dissolved. Anne's subsequent untimely death affected him deeply, and he never pursued marriage again, instead channeling his emotional energies into the affairs of state. The following decades saw Buchanan's diplomatic credentials flourish as he served in increasingly prominent roles. As minister to Russia under President Andrew Jackson, he honed the negotiation skills that would become his hallmark. Returning home, he represented Pennsylvania in the United States Senate, where his oratorical precision and command of constitutional law earned bipartisan respect. His appointment as Secretary of State during James Polk's administration placed him at the center of consequential foreign policy decisions, including the peaceful resolution of the Oregon boundary dispute with Great Britain and strategic positioning during the Mexican-American War. In 1853, President Franklin Pierce dispatched Buchanan as minister to Great Britain, an assignment that would prove providential for his presidential ambitions. While overseas negotiating matters, including the controversial Ostend Manifesto advocating American acquisition of Cuba, Buchanan remained providentially distant from the intensifying domestic discord over slavery and states' rights. This fortuitous absence preserved his political viability, while contemporaries were forced to stake divisive positions on issues tearing at the national fabric. By 1856, America stood precariously balanced on the precipice of disunion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had inflamed sectional tensions. Violent confrontations erupted in Bleeding Kansas, and political parties fractured along geographical lines. Into this volatile climate stepped Buchanan, presenting himself as the experienced statesman whose lengthy resume and perceived moderation might bridge the widening chasm. The Democratic Party, desperate for unity, nominated him as their standard-bearer against Republican John C. Fremont and former President Millard Fillmore of the Know-Nothing Party. With solid support from southern states and sufficient northern Democratic backing, Buchanan secured victory, becoming the 15th president of a nation unraveling at its seams. From his inauguration, Buchanan envisioned himself as a constitutional steward, a president who would restore harmony through strict adherence to established law. He believed profoundly in the power of institutional frameworks and legal precedents to resolve even the most contentious disputes. This legalistic approach, however, would prove catastrophically inadequate for the moral crisis engulfing the nation. The new president's troubles began almost immediately with the controversy surrounding Kansas statehood. Rather than demanding a fair process, Buchanan supported the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, despite overwhelming evidence of electoral fraud and intimidation. This decision alienated significant portions of his northern support base, including powerful Democrats like Stephen Douglas, while failing to satisfy Southern extremists. Then came the judicial earthquake that would define his presidency. The Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott case declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens, and that Congress lacked authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. Far from maintaining impartiality, Buchanan had inappropriately pressured Northern justices behind closed doors to join their Southern colleagues in the decision, believing this would settle the slavery question definitively. Instead, it inflamed tensions beyond measure and shattered what remained of Buchanan's credibility as an honest broker. The final years of his administration witnessed a cascade of disasters. An economic panic in 1857 brought financial hardship across the nation. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 ignited fears of slave insurrections throughout the South. The Democratic Party, no longer able to maintain even a pretense of national unity, splintered into Northern and Southern factions, ensuring Republican electoral success. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln secured the presidency without winning a single Southern state, a clear harbinger of the coming crisis. When South Carolina led the secession movement in December, Buchanan responded with paralyzing indecision. Trapped within his narrow constitutional interpretation, he declared secession illegal, but simultaneously maintained that the federal government lacked authority to prevent it. A bewildering position that satisfied neither North nor South. During the agonizing 4 months between Lincoln's election and inauguration, Buchanan essentially abdicated leadership as the country disintegrated around him. Federal forts, arsenals, and treasuries throughout the South fell into Confederate hands with barely a gesture of resistance from Washington. When pressed to act decisively, Buchanan retreated into legalistic arguments and pleas for patience, hoping desperately that compromise might yet emerge from congressional deliberations. On March 4th, 1861, a visibly relieved Buchanan surrendered the presidency to Lincoln. According to witnesses, he confided to his successor, "If you are as happy in entering the presidency as I am in leaving it, you are a very happy man indeed." He departed Washington for his beloved estate, Wheatland, in Pennsylvania, where he spent his remaining years crafting memoirs intended to vindicate his administration's choices. Buchanan did not live to see the full reconstruction of the Union he had failed to preserve. Death claimed him on June 1st, 1868, just 3 years after the Civil War's conclusion. History has not been kind to the 15th president, consistently ranking him among America's least effective chief executives. Yet Buchanan was not motivated by malice or indifference. Rather, he was a man thoroughly trapped by his own limitations, unable to transcend his reverence for institutional process when the moment demanded moral clarity and decisive action. The tragedy of James Buchanan lies not in deliberate wrongdoing, but in his fundamental misreading of the crisis confronting him. A gifted diplomat schooled in the art of compromise, he encountered a moral conflict that no negotiation could resolve. When America needed vision, he offered procedure. When it required courage, he counseled patience. His presidency stands as a sobering reminder that in certain historical moments, adherence to precedent and constitutional literalism may prove insufficient to address profound moral challenges. In the quiet halls of Wheatland, As evening shadows lengthened across his study, the elderly statesman often sat writing by candlelight, quill in hand, desperately attempting to explain to posterity why his approach had failed. He was neither villain nor hero, simply a man of another time, overwhelmed by forces he could neither comprehend nor control. For while James Buchanan steadfastly believed the Constitution could withstand any political storm, he failed to recognize that some tempests require not just legal interpretation, but moral leadership and decisive action. The gathering clouds of civil conflict demanded a president who could navigate by the stars of justice when constitutional maps proved inadequate. Instead, America had a captain who, for all his experience and dignity, could not bring himself to seize the wheel when the ship of state drifted toward catastrophe. In the tender light of a winter morning on February 12th, 1809, while much of the young American nation remained untamed wilderness, a new life began in a humble log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. The infant born that day to Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln would travel a remarkable journey from poverty to power, from obscurity to immortality. This child, Abraham Lincoln, would one day guide his country through its darkest hour and forever alter the meaning of American freedom. The Lincoln family knew hardship intimately. Thomas Lincoln, a carpenter and farmer of modest abilities, moved his family frequently in search of better prospects. First to Indiana when Abraham was 7, and later to Illinois. Young Abraham's childhood was marked by the relentless demands of frontier life, clearing land, planting crops, and building shelter with his own hands. When Abraham was merely 9 years old, tragedy struck as his mother Nancy succumbed to milk sickness, a disease contracted from drinking contaminated milk. Her death left an indelible impression on the sensitive boy, a profound sense of loss that would resurface throughout his life in bouts of melancholy. Formal education was a luxury the Lincoln family could ill afford. Abraham's schooling amounted to less than 12 months in total, spread across several itinerant teachers in what he later described as education by littles. Yet within this seemingly disadvantaged youth burned an extraordinary hunger for knowledge. He would walk miles to borrow books, studying by firelight after exhausting days of physical labor. The Bible, Aesop's fables, Pilgrim's Progress, Shakespeare, and Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England became his university. He copied passages using charcoal on wooden planks when paper was scarce, committing beautiful language and powerful ideas to memory. This relentless self-improvement transformed the gangly frontier youth into one of America's most thoughtful and eloquent voices. Lincoln's physical appearance was striking. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with limbs so long and body so lean that he appeared almost otherworldly to some observers. His face, deeply lined even in youth, seemed to carry the weight of ancient wisdom. Contemporaries often remarked on the startling contrast between his somewhat ungainly appearance and the surprising grace he displayed. when animated by ideas that stirred his passion. During his 20s, Lincoln tried his hand at many occupations, splitting rails, clerking in a general store, serving as postmaster, surveying land, and even captaining a militia company during the Black Hawk War. Though he would later joke that the only battles he fought were against mosquitoes, each experience broadened his understanding of human nature and the diverse struggles of ordinary Americans. His natural gift for storytelling and his disarming honesty gradually built his reputation in New Salem and later Springfield, Illinois, where he eventually settled. Determined to rise above his circumstances, Lincoln borrowed law books and studied independently. Passing the bar examination in 1836, he began practicing law in Springfield, joining the 8th Judicial Circuit, where he would ride horseback between rural courthouses, developing a practice that served farmers, merchants, and railroad companies alike. His plain-spoken style, logical precision, and uncanny ability to explain complex legal concepts in relatable terms earned him the trust of juries and the nickname Honest Abe. Politics and law intertwined in Lincoln's life from an early stage. He served 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party, advocating for internal improvements like roads and canals. In 1842, he married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a prominent Kentucky family who brought social connections and political ambition to their union. Their relationship was complex, marked by passionate attachment and frequent discord, as Mary's volatile temperament clashed with Abraham's more reserved nature. Together they had 4 sons, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, known as Tad. Only Robert would survive to adulthood, a series of personal tragedies that deepened Lincoln's already contemplative nature. Lincoln won election to a single term in the United States House of Representatives, serving from 1847 to 1849. There, he opposed President Polk's Mexican-American war policies, introducing resolutions demanding to know the exact spot where American blood had first been shed to justify the conflict. This stance proved unpopular with constituents, and Lincoln temporarily retreated from politics to focus on his flourishing legal practice. The political landscape dramatically shifted in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, legislation that allowed territories to determine through popular sovereignty whether they would permit slavery. This effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery in northern territories. Lincoln was morally outraged, though not yet advocating for immediate abolition. He believed profoundly that slavery contradicted the foundational American principle that all men are created equal. The Kansas-Nebraska Act reignited Lincoln's political passion, and he helped organize the new Republican Party in Illinois, dedicated to preventing slavery's expansion. The watershed moment in Lincoln's rise to national prominence came during the Illinois senatorial campaign of 1858, challenging incumbent Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Lincoln proposed a series of 7 debates across the state, these Lincoln-Douglas debates, addressing the most divisive issue of the day, captivated the nation. Lincoln's moral clarity shone through his carefully reasoned arguments. In his acceptance speech for the Republican nomination, he had invoked biblical imagery. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Though Lincoln lost this Senate race by a narrow margin, the debates established him as a thoughtful voice on the national stage. By 1860, sectional tensions had reached a breaking point. The Democratic Party split along regional lines, and Lincoln secured the Republican presidential nomination, partly because his views on slavery seemed more moderate than those of other Republican leaders. In a four-way race, Lincoln won the presidency with just 40% of the popular vote, but a clear electoral college majority. He didn't appear on ballots in most southern states. Before Lincoln could even take office, 7 southern states declared their secession from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, Lincoln appealed for unity. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." His conciliatory tone did little to ease tensions. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on April 12th, the Civil War began in earnest. Lincoln faced a leadership challenge unlike any previous president. With no formal military training, he had to quickly master the art of war. He devoured books on military strategy, spent countless hours in the telegraph office awaiting battlefield reports, and frequently visited troops. His early selection of generals proved disappointing. George McClellan was brilliant at organizing, but reluctant to fight. Others showed courage, but lacked strategic vision. Lincoln's persistent search for effective leadership eventually led him to Ulysses S. Grant, whose determination matched the president's own. The war's early years brought humiliating Union defeats at Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. Lincoln bore these reversals with remarkable resilience, often using humor to mask his deep anguish. "I have been driven many times upon my knees," he confessed, "by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go." He faced criticism from all directions. Radical Republicans demanded immediate emancipation and harsher treatment of the South. Democrats criticized his expansion of presidential powers, and many questioned his suspension of habeas corpus in border states. Through the darkest days of the conflict, Lincoln maintained his fundamental humanity. He reviewed cases of soldiers sentenced to death for desertion or sleeping on duty, frequently granting clemency that exasperated his generals, but revealed his compassionate nature. "I am trying to evade the butchering business," he explained. Lincoln's understanding of the war evolved significantly during his presidency. What began as a conflict to preserve the Union transformed into something more profound. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring free all slaves in Confederate-controlled territories. While the proclamation could not be immediately enforced in areas under rebel control, It fundamentally altered the war's character and purpose. It allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, eventually bringing nearly 200,000 black soldiers into the fight for their own freedom. The president later reflected, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." Indeed, though the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, those in border states that remained in the Union were exempted. It represented a decisive moral turning point. Lincoln had transformed the Civil War into a struggle not merely to restore the nation, but to redeem its founding promise of liberty. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a national cemetery at the site of the war's bloodiest battle. His brief remarks, just 272 words delivered in under 3 minutes, would become one of history's most celebrated speeches. The Gettysburg Address reframed the American experiment as a new birth of freedom and defined democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people. In 10 eloquent sentences, Lincoln connected the sacrifice of Union soldiers to the nation's founding ideals and outlined a vision for a more perfect Union. As the war progressed, Lincoln pursued additional measures to address slavery permanently, supporting the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would abolish the institution entirely. Meanwhile, he developed increasingly detailed plans for Reconstruction, emphasizing reconciliation rather than retribution. "With malice toward none, with charity for all," he urged in his second inaugural address. "Let us bind up the nation's wounds." Throughout the brutal 4-year conflict, Lincoln carried personal burdens alongside national ones. His beloved son, Willie, died of typhoid fever in 1862, plunging Mary into prolonged grief and leading the president to seek solace in poetry and philosophical reflection. The war's mounting casualties weighed heavily on him. Observers noted how dramatically Lincoln aged in office, his face deeply furrowed, his stooped posture accentuated, his eyes revealing profound weariness. By early 1865, Union victory appeared inevitable. General William Tecumseh Sherman had completed his devastating march to the sea through Georgia, and Grant had Richmond, the Confederate capital, under siege. Lincoln visited the fallen city in April, walking through streets where former slaves joyfully welcomed him as their liberator. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the rebellion. Just 5 days later, on Good Friday, April 14th, Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. Shortly after 10 o'clock, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and well-known actor, entered the presidential box and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president never regained consciousness and died the following morning at 7:22, becoming the first American president to be assassinated. The nation plunged into unprecedented mourning. Lincoln's funeral train traveled 1,700 miles through cities and countryside on its journey back to Springfield, as millions of Americans lined the tracks to pay their respects. the humble rail splitter had become a national savior. The self-educated lawyer had become a philosophical statesman. And the man who entered office with the Union dissolving had preserved it at the cost of 600,000 lives, including his own. Abraham Lincoln transformed the American presidency, expanded executive authority during wartime, preserved the Union, and set in motion the legal end of slavery. More profoundly, he articulated a vision of America as a nation dedicated to human equality and opportunity, a last best hope of earth, where people might rise from humble beginnings through honest labor and self-improvement. As you contemplate his remarkable journey, imagine a solitary figure pacing the White House corridors during sleepless wartime nights, his angular frame casting long shadows on the wall. Picture him sitting beside his son's sickbed, reading Shakespeare for comfort amid personal grief. Envision him drafting the Emancipation Proclamation by lamplight, knowing its words would forever change the nation he loved. See him at Gettysburg, his tall form rising above the crowd, speaking words so perfect in their simplicity that they would echo through generations. For in Abraham Lincoln, this self-made man from the American frontier, we find not just a president, but a poet-statesman who found words equal to his nation's greatest trial. He believed in democracy's possibilities when its future seemed most uncertain. He saw beyond the bloody present to a more perfect union, and by embodying the very best of the American character, its compassion alongside its determination, its humility alongside its confidence, Abraham Lincoln not only saved a nation, but helped define what it might yet become. On a winter morning of December 29th, 1808, as America was still finding its footing as a young republic, a child was born into stark poverty in Raleigh, North Carolina. This boy, Andrew Johnson, would travel an improbable path from destitution to the highest office in the land, becoming the 17th President of the United States during one of its most tumultuous periods. His story embodies both the promise of American democracy and its profound limitations. Hardship shaped Johnson from his earliest days. His father Jacob, a humble porter at an inn and occasional constable, died when Andrew was merely 3 years old, possibly from injuries sustained while rescuing 2 men from drowning. This tragedy left his mother Mary, a washerwoman, struggling to provide for her 2 young sons. The Johnson family knew hunger intimately, their existence a daily battle against the harsh realities of life without means or connections in the early 19th century South. At the tender age of 10, Andrew and his brother William were apprenticed to a local tailor named James Selby. This arrangement, born of necessity rather than choice, provided basic sustenance, but denied young Johnson any opportunity for formal education. The apprenticeship was demanding and restrictive, so much so that after 5 years of service, both boys fled, technically becoming fugitives as they had broken their apprenticeship contracts. They wandered for 2 years before eventually returning to Raleigh, where Andrew attempted to reconcile with his former master, only to be rebuffed. This early rejection propelled Johnson westward to Tennessee, a move that would ultimately shape the nation's history. He settled in the small community of Greenville, where he established his own tailoring business at the age of 18. While his hands crafted garments for the townspeople, his mind absorbed every scrap of knowledge it could gather. The tailor's shop became his informal classroom. As he worked, local men would gather to read newspapers aloud and debate politics, inadvertently providing Johnson's political education. What Johnson lacked in formal schooling, he compensated for with fierce determination. He taught himself to read through sheer persistence, practicing letters and words in spare moments between stitches. His marriage to Eliza McCardle in 1827 proved transformative, as his educated young wife helped refine his writing and speaking abilities. Together, they built a life that gradually improved their circumstances, eventually acquiring property and even slaves. A complex moral contradiction that would later inform Johnson's complicated views on race and freedom. Johnson's entry into politics began modestly as an alderman in Greenville, but his natural affinity for connecting with ordinary citizens propelled him upward. He won election as mayor at just 22, then advanced to the Tennessee state legislature, where he championed measures benefiting small farmers and laborers. His political identity crystallized around defending the interests of the common white working man against what he perceived as the corrupt influence of wealthy plantation owners and financial elites. This populist stance resonated powerfully with voters, carrying Johnson to 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, 2 terms as governor of Tennessee, and eventually to the United States Senate in 1857. Throughout his ascent, Johnson maintained his identity as a self-made man. He proudly displayed his humble origins rather than concealing them, often beginning speeches by reminding audiences that he had risen from poverty through labor and perseverance. Even as he gained prominence, he continued to identify fundamentally with those who worked with their hands, mechanics, farmers, and laborers, rather than with the political establishment. Johnson's relationship with slavery reflected profound contradictions that characterized many Americans of his era. Though he himself owned slaves until emancipation became law, he viewed the plantation system with suspicion, arguing that it disadvantaged poor whites by monopolizing land and devaluing manual labor. "I am for a white man's government," he would declare, positioning himself as an advocate for non-slaveholding whites rather than as a champion for enslaved African Americans. This narrow vision of equality, centered on opportunity for white laborers, would ultimately limit his capacity to lead during Reconstruction. When the storm clouds of Civil War gathered, Johnson faced an excruciating choice. His beloved Tennessee voted to secede from the Union, joining the Confederate States of America. Johnson, however, remained steadfastly loyal to the federal government. This stance required extraordinary courage, as it made him a pariah in his home state and placed his family in physical danger. He was the only senator from a seceding state who refused to resign his seat, declaring, "I will not give up this government. No, I intend to stand by it, and I will hold it up as long as I can." President Abraham Lincoln recognized the symbolic importance of Southern Unionists like Johnson. In 1862, after Union forces recaptured Nashville, Lincoln appointed Johnson as military governor of Tennessee, a perilous position that required armed guards for protection. Johnson's harsh treatment of Confederate sympathizers during this period earned him both admiration from Unionists and bitter enmity from secessionists. He demonstrated unflinching resolve, declaring that treason must be made infamous and traitors punished. By 1864, with the war's tide turning in favor of the Union, Lincoln sought to broaden his political coalition for the upcoming presidential election and begin planning for national reconciliation. He replaced his first-term vice president Hannibal Hamlin with Johnson, creating the National Union Party ticket that strategically paired a Northern Republican with a Southern Democrat. This decision was calculated to appeal to war-weary voters and symbolize the possibility of reunion across sectional lines. The Lincoln-Johnson ticket prevailed in November 1864, but the victory celebration would prove tragically brief. On April 14, 1865, just 6 weeks after their inauguration and mere days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. The nation, barely beginning to process the war's end, was plunged into fresh grief and uncertainty. The following morning, a somber group gathered in Johnson's boarding house room, where Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase administered the presidential oath. Johnson, reportedly having consumed whiskey to calm his nerves before the ceremony, suddenly found himself leading a fractured nation through its most profound crisis of rebuilding since the founding era. The tailor from Tennessee, with no formal education and limited executive experience, now occupied the office previously held by Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. Johnson inherited a nation physically devastated and emotionally exhausted by 4 years of brutal civil war. Over 600,000 Americans lay dead. Southern infrastructure lay in ruins, and 4 million formerly enslaved people had been liberated but faced uncertain futures. The constitutional questions were equally daunting. What status would former Confederate states hold? How would former Confederates be treated? What rights would newly freed African Americans possess? Johnson moved quickly to implement his vision of Reconstruction, issuing amnesty proclamations and recognizing provisional governments in former Confederate states with minimal conditions. His approach reflected his strict constructionist view of the Constitution, believing that states had never legally left the Union. He reasoned they should be rapidly restored to full participation, with their internal affairs left largely to local control. This vision soon collided with that of the radical Republicans in Congress, who sought more fundamental transformation of Southern society and stronger protections for freed people. The ensuing battle would define Johnson's presidency and significantly shape America's trajectory on matters of race and citizenship. The gulf between Johnson and Congress widened dramatically over civil rights legislation. When Congress passed bills expanding the Freedmen's Bureau, established to aid former slaves, and guaranteeing basic civil rights for African Americans, Johnson wielded his veto power, arguing that such measures unconstitutionally favored one group of citizens and interfered with states' rights. Congress, holding sufficient majorities, overrode these vetoes. The first significant legislation in American history to become law despite presidential opposition. Johnson's resistance to civil rights protections had profound consequences. As Southern states enacted restrictive, black codes limiting freedmen's rights, Johnson's administration offered little response. His public statements increasingly displayed racial animus, at one point suggesting that African Americans lacked capacity for self-government. His actions emboldened former Confederates, while leaving freed people vulnerable to violence and economic exploitation. The conflict between President and Congress reached its apex in 1868, when Johnson attempted to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a radical Republican ally. He violated the recently passed Tenure of Office Act, which required Senate approval for removing certain office holders. Radical Republicans seized this opportunity, impeaching Johnson on February 24th. The first impeachment of a president in American history. Johnson's Senate trial became a national spectacle, lasting nearly 3 months. The formal charges centered on the Tenure of Office Act violation. But the real issue was the fundamental direction of Reconstruction policy. The nation watched as senators considered whether to remove a president for the first time. In the end, the vote fell one short of the necessary 2/3 majority, with 7 Republican senators breaking ranks to acquit Johnson. Believing that removal would set a dangerous precedent of undermining presidential independence for political differences rather than clear high crimes. Though Johnson avoided removal, his presidency was effectively crippled. Congress seized control of Reconstruction, passing the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection under law and imposing military districts across the former Confederacy. Johnson served out his term in relative isolation, denied the Democratic nomination in 1868, and watching as his former general, Ulysses S. Grant, succeeded him as president. After leaving the White House, Johnson returned to Greenville, his political ambitions undiminished. He sought vindication through election to the Senate and House, but faced repeated disappointment. Finally, in January 1875, the Tennessee legislature elected him to the United States Senate, making him the only former president to later serve in that chamber. This triumph was short-lived, however. After attending a special Senate session, Johnson suffered a stroke while visiting his daughter in eastern Tennessee and died on July 31st, 1875, at age 66. Andrew Johnson's grave in Greenville bears his requested epitaph. His faith in the people never wavered. Yet history reveals the limitations of that faith. His conception of the people excluded millions of African Americans whose rights he failed to defend at a pivotal moment. His presidency represents one of history's great might-have-beens. Had Lincoln lived, or had Johnson embraced a more inclusive vision of citizenship, America's path toward racial equality might have taken a different course. Johnson was neither villain nor hero, but rather a man whose virtues and flaws alike were magnified by extraordinary circumstances. His remarkable rise from poverty demonstrated American democracy's promise of mobility across class lines. Yet his narrow vision of that democracy, limited by the racial attitudes of his era and his own stubborn temperament, ultimately undermined his presidency's potential. As evening shadows lengthen, imagine a man hunched over fabric in a small Tennessee shop, the lamplight illuminating his determined face as he teaches himself to read between stitches. Picture him standing resolute in the Senate chamber as former colleagues depart for the Confederacy, alone in his loyalty to a nation coming apart. See him in the White House, caught between his interpretation of the Constitution and the transformative possibilities of a war that had forever changed America. For Andrew Johnson believed passionately in preserving the Union, but could not fully embrace the more perfect union that might have emerged from its trials. In a small, quiet town along the winding banks of the Ohio River, on a cool April day in the year 1822, a child was born who would one day carry the weight of a nation on his shoulders. His name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, yet through a bureaucratic twist at West Point, history would remember him as Ulysses S. Grant, a name that would become a symbol of quiet strength and unyielding determination. Raised in the humble home of Jesse and Hannah Grant, young Ulysses grew up surrounded by the smell of leather and the hum of work. His father, a tanner and leather merchant. As a boy, he was quiet, preferring the company of horses over other children. Those who knew him saw a gentle soul, a child who rarely boasted, who never sought conflict, but who showed an almost magical skill with horses, riding bareback with ease and confidence. At the age of 17, his father secured him an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Ulysses did not want to go, but he went out of duty. There he was a middling student, struggling with mathematics, but excelling in horsemanship. His friends called him Sam, and though he rarely spoke, they admired his calm courage. He graduated in the middle of his class, neither a star nor a failure, yet something in his quiet determination set him apart. Grant's first taste of war came in Mexico, where he served under Generals Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. He saw the horrors of battle, but also learned the art of command. Yet the experience left him with a deep disdain for war's brutalities. He married Julia Dent, a woman of warmth and grace, whose unwavering love would be a constant light in his life. But peace proved challenging. Stuck in remote outposts, far from his family, Grant struggled with loneliness and despair. Alcohol became a shadow, a companion he would battle for the rest of his life. By 1854, he resigned from the army, a defeated man. Farming failed. Business ventures collapsed. By the year 1860, he was working in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. A quiet, almost forgotten man. But history had other plans. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Grant volunteered for the Union. At first, he was given minor commands, but his relentless drive for action soon caught attention. In Tennessee, he captured Fort Donelson, demanding unconditional surrender, a phrase that captured the nation's imagination. At Shiloh, he endured fierce criticism for heavy losses, but refused to retreat. War, he knew, was a storm, and victory required courage to stand within it. His greatest triumph came at Vicksburg in 1863, where through brilliant maneuvering, he split the Confederacy in two. Lincoln saw in Grant a man who fought without complaint, who pressed forward when others faltered. By 1864, Grant commanded all Union armies, facing the legendary Robert E. Lee. Their battles were brutal: Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. But Grant never broke. He knew that victory required endurance. When Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox in 1865, Grant showed his true character. His terms were generous, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Hailed as a hero, Grant returned home, and in 1868, the American people turned to him for leadership. As the 18th President of the United States, he championed civil rights, supported the 15th Amendment, and used federal power to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people. But his presidency was also marred by scandal. Grant, honest to a fault, trusted the wrong men, and corruption spread around him. After 2 terms, he left office and traveled the world, honored by kings and commoners alike. But his final years were marked by suffering. A fraudulent investment scheme robbed him of his savings, and soon after, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. Facing death, he began writing his memoirs, determined to provide for his family. Day by day, in agony, he wrote. He finished just days before he died on July 23rd, 1885. Ulysses S. Grant was a man of quiet strength, a leader forged in the fires of conflict, who rose from near obscurity to command vast armies and guide a wounded nation. He was not perfect. He struggled, he failed, he trusted too easily, but he never gave up. His legacy endures as a reminder that true greatness is not born from brilliance or ambition, but from resilience and resolve. In the quiet town of Delaware, Ohio, on a cool autumn day in early October of 1822, a baby boy was born to Sophia Burchard Hayes. She named him Rutherford Burchard Hayes, and from the very start, his life was shaped by both loss and resilience. Just 10 weeks before his birth, his father had passed away, leaving Sophia a young widow. But Sophia was a woman of strength, raising Rutherford and his sister with patience, wisdom, and an unwavering sense of duty. She read to them, filling their world with stories of courage and virtue, planting in Rutherford a love for books and a clear sense of right and wrong. As Rutherford grew, he became known for his quiet thoughtfulness. He was not the loudest boy in the room, but he listened carefully, thought deeply, and spoke with calm conviction. His path led him to Kenyon College, where his brilliance earned him the title of valedictorian. From there, he pursued a law degree at Harvard, where he not only sharpened his mind, but also developed a sense of justice that would guide him for the rest of his life. Returning to Ohio, Rutherford established a successful legal practice. Known for his integrity, he became a trusted lawyer, admired for his dedication to fairness. It was during these years that he met Lucy Webb, a bright and compassionate woman who shared his sense of purpose. Their marriage was a partnership of hearts and minds, and Lucy's warmth and intelligence made her a beloved figure wherever they lived. Together, they raised 8 children, though sorrow touched their lives as 3 of them did not survive to adulthood. When the American Civil War erupted, Rutherford, though nearly 40 and a father, did not hesitate. He joined the Union Army, becoming a leader known for his bravery and unwavering sense of duty. At the Battle of South Mountain, he was shot in the arm but refused to leave his men, a testament to his courage. His leadership earned him the respect of his troops and his rise to the rank of brigadier general. He saw the horrors of war, but he also saw the resilience of those who fought for a united nation. After the war, Rutherford's reputation as an honorable man led him to politics. He served as a United States congressman, and then as governor of Ohio. His time as governor was marked by a commitment to reform, particularly in public education and the rights of African Americans. He fought for equality, believing that the nation should stand for justice for all its citizens. In 1876, the Republican Party chose Rutherford B. Hayes as their presidential candidate. It was a time of division and distrust, and the election against Democrat Samuel J. Tilden became one of the most contested in American history. Tilden won the popular vote, but the outcome was mired in disputes over electoral votes from 4 states. Weeks of chaos followed, but a compromise was struck. Hayes would become president, but federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. As president, Hayes led with integrity and a desire to heal the nation. He promoted civil service reform, fighting against the corruption of the patronage system. He spoke openly about the importance of equal rights for all Americans. Though his decision to end Reconstruction left many African Americans vulnerable to discrimination and violence, Hayes believed that reconciliation could be achieved through goodwill, a hope that history would prove tragically naive. After 1 term, as promised, Hayes stepped away from the presidency, returning to his home at Spiegel Grove in Fremont, Ohio. But his commitment to public service did not end. He devoted his later years to promoting education, especially for African Americans and disadvantaged youth. He spoke about prison reform, championing rehabilitation over punishment, and remained active in philanthropic work. When his beloved Lucy passed away in 1889, Rutherford was heartbroken, but he continued his work, honoring her memory. In January of 1893, Rutherford B. Hayes passed away. He was remembered as a man of integrity and quiet strength, a president whose name might not inspire grand statues, but whose life was a testament to the values of honesty, service, and the quiet courage to do what was right.